Picture this. You are standing in the shadowed corridors of the Alcázar of Madrid on a suffocating summer morning in 1665 AD. The air hangs thick with incense and the metallic scent of blood-soaked rags. Through the heavy oak doors, you hear the laboured breathing of a woman in the throes of childbirth. But this is no ordinary birth. This is the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of calculated genetic catastrophe, a moment when the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity would finally manifest in flesh and bone. The woman crying out behind those doors is Queen Mariana of Austria, niece and wife to King Philip IV of Spain. Yes, you heard correctly, niece and wife. The man pacing the marble floors outside is not just her husband and king, but her uncle, 30 years her senior. The child struggling to enter this world will be Charles II of Spain, and his very existence will embody the monstrous consequences of royal inbreeding taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. You can smell the fear seeping from the walls like dampness. The courtiers whisper in hushed tones, their silk slippers barely making a sound as they shuffle nervously. They know, as does everyone in the palace, that the Spanish Habsburg line teeters on the edge of extinction. The previous heirs, Philip Prospero and Maria Teresa, had died young, their bodies too weak to sustain life. Now, as the Queen's screams echo through the halls, the fate of an empire hangs in the balance. But the real horror isn't just in this moment, it's in the century and a half of deliberate choices that led to it. Each marriage arrangement, each political alliance sealed with blood relations, each decision to marry cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, has been a step toward this inevitable catastrophe. The Habsburgs didn't stumble into genetic disaster, they orchestrated it with the precision of a funeral march. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story of Charles II begins not with his birth, but with his ancestry, a family tree so tangled it resembles a spider's web more than branches reaching toward the sun. To understand the magnitude of what happened in that Madrid palace, we must first journey back to the origins of Habsburg power and trace the methodical destruction of human genetics that would span generations. The Habsburg dynasty rose to prominence in the 13th century AD, but their true genetic experiment began in earnest with Emperor Maximilian I in the late 1400s. Maximilian understood something that would become the family motto, Bella gerant alii tu Felix Austria nuba. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Marriage wasn't about love or even political alliance in the traditional sense. It was about accumulating power through bloodlines while keeping that power contained within the family circle. The strategy worked brilliantly at first. Through a series of carefully orchestrated marriages, the Habsburgs came to control vast territories across Europe. By the time Charles V inherited the throne in 1519 AD, the Habsburg Empire stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to Naples. The sun, quite literally, never set on Habsburg domains, but even as their political power reached its zenith, the genetic foundation was already cracking. Charles V himself was the product of first-cousin marriage. His parents, Philip I of Castile and Joanna of Castile, shared grandparents. When Charles V abdicated in 1556 AD, he divided his massive empire between his son Philip II, who would rule Spain, and his brother Ferdinand I, who would rule Austria. This division would prove crucial to our story, because it created 2 separate but intertwined Habsburg lines that would spend the next century systematically intermarrying. Philip II of Spain became the architect of the dynasty's genetic doom. Married 4 times, he understood that to maintain Habsburg dominance, he must marry within the family. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin. When she died in childbirth, he married Mary I of England, a political alliance that briefly made him King of England. After Mary's death, he married Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, but this was a rare departure from family tradition. His 4th and final marriage, however, set the template for disaster. In 1570 AD, at age 43, Philip II married his 20-year-old niece Anna of Austria. Anna was the daughter of Philip's brother-in-law, Emperor Maximilian II, making her not just his niece but also his first cousin once removed. Their union produced the future Philip III, born in 1578 AD, and it was this child who would carry the genetic burden forward into the next generation. The mathematics of inbreeding are as precise as they are terrifying. Each time close relatives reproduce, the coefficient of inbreeding increases exponentially. Normal human populations have an inbreeding coefficient near 0, First cousins who marry have a coefficient of 0.0625, meaning their children are 6.25% more likely to inherit identical copies of harmful recessive genes. But the Habsburgs weren't content with single-generation inbreeding. They practiced it systematically across multiple generations. Philip III, born from the union of uncle and niece, inherited a coefficient of inbreeding already elevated beyond safe levels. When it came time for him to marry, the family doubled down on their genetic gamble. In 1599 AD, Philip III married Margaret of Austria, who was not only his first cousin but also his sister-in-law's sister. The mathematical complexity of their relationship defies simple description. They were related through multiple lines of descent, amplifying the genetic risks with each shared ancestor. Their son Philip IV, born in 1605 AD, entered the world with an inbreeding coefficient that would have been alarming in any other family. But for the Habsburgs, it was simply the cost of maintaining power. Philip IV's jaw already showed the telltale signs of the Habsburg lip, a protruding lower mandible that made eating and speaking difficult. His mental capacity, while not severely compromised, showed the subtle signs of cognitive decline that would become more pronounced in future generations. The Habsburg lip, or mandibular prognathism, serves as a visible marker of the family's genetic deterioration. This distinctive facial deformity results from the inheritance of recessive genes that control jaw development. In normal populations, these genes are masked by dominant alleles, but in highly inbred families, the recessive traits express themselves with increasing frequency and severity. Contemporary portraits of Habsburg rulers show the gradual progression of this deformity. Early Habsburg emperors like Maximilian I show mild signs of the protruding jaw. By the time of Charles V, the deformity is clearly visible, but not yet debilitating. Philip II's portraits reveal a more pronounced version, and Philip III's jaw projects noticeably forward. But these were merely previews of the genetic catastrophe that awaited in the next generation. Philip IV's reign, lasting from 1621 to 1665 AD, coincided with Spain's gradual decline from the heights of imperial power. While political and economic factors contributed to this decline, the king's personal struggles with the effects of inbreeding cannot be ignored. His difficulty speaking clearly affected his ability to communicate with advisors and foreign dignitaries. His recurring health problems, including seizures and chronic fatigue, impacted his decision-making capabilities during crucial moments in Spanish history. But Philip IV's most significant contribution to the Habsburg genetic disaster was his choice of bride. In 1649 AD, at age 44, he married his 15-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. Mariana was the daughter of Philip IV's sister, Maria Anna of Spain, and Emperor Ferdinand III of Austria. This meant that Philip IV was simultaneously Mariana's uncle, her first cousin once removed, and related to her through multiple other lines of descent. The marriage arrangement demonstrates the Habsburg family's complete commitment to their genetic experiment. Mariana had originally been betrothed to Philip IV's son, Prince Balthasar Charles, but when the prince died in 1646 AD, the family simply reassigned her to his father. The 29-year age difference was irrelevant. What mattered was keeping the bloodline pure and the inheritance within the family circle. Contemporary accounts describe Mariana as a frail, nervous young woman who struggled with the responsibilities of queenship. Born in 1634 AD, she had been raised in the Austrian court with the expectation that she would marry within the family, but the reality of becoming queen to her own uncle proved overwhelming. Court observers noted her frequent illnesses, her difficulty with public speaking, and her tendency toward melancholy, all symptoms that would later appear in magnified form in her son. The union of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria produced several children, but most died in infancy or early childhood. Maria Theresa, born in 1638 AD from Philip's first marriage, survived to adulthood but was given in marriage to Louis XIV of France as part of a peace treaty. Philip Prospero, born in 1657 AD from his union with Mariana, was hailed as the heir to the Spanish throne, but his health was precarious from birth. Philip Prospero's short life offers a preview of the horrors that awaited the next generation. Born after multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, he was weak and sickly from his first breath. Contemporary accounts describe a child who struggled to walk, spoke with difficulty, and suffered from frequent seizures. His immune system was so compromised that common childhood illnesses nearly killed him repeatedly. When he finally succumbed to illness in 1661 AD at age 4, the Spanish court was left in desperate need of an heir. The pressure on Queen Mariana to produce another son was immense. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by military defeats and economic decline, needed a strong ruler to maintain its position in European politics. But the genetic odds were stacked against any child born from the union of Philip IV and Mariana. Their inbreeding coefficient was so high that any offspring would be at extreme risk for genetic disorders, physical deformities, and mental disabilities. It was into this context of desperation and genetic catastrophe that Charles II of Spain was born on November 6, 1665 AD. The labour was difficult and prolonged, with Queen Mariana experiencing complications that nearly cost both mother and child their lives. When the infant finally emerged, the attending physicians and midwives immediately recognised that something was terribly wrong. Charles II's appearance at birth was shocking even by Habsburg standards. His head was disproportionately large, his limbs were weak and underdeveloped, and his facial features were severely distorted. The Habsburg lip, which had been gradually worsening across generations, reached its most extreme form in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that his teeth couldn't meet properly, making it impossible for him to chew solid food effectively. But the physical deformities were only the beginning of Charles II's suffering. His mental development was severely delayed, and he didn't speak his first words until age 4. Even then, his speech was nearly unintelligible due to his jaw deformity and apparent cognitive impairment. He couldn't walk without assistance until age 8, and his motor skills remained severely compromised throughout his life. The court physicians, trained in the medical understanding of the 17th century, had no comprehension of genetics or the scientific basis for Charles II's condition. They attributed his problems to supernatural causes, political curses, or divine punishment. Some blamed his mother's diet during pregnancy, others suggested that evil spirits had possessed the child. The most common explanation was that God was punishing the Spanish royal family for their sins. The reality was far more mundane but equally terrifying. Charles II was the inevitable result of nearly 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than that of children born to sibling parents. In genetic terms, he was more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. This extreme level of inbreeding meant that Charles II inherited identical copies of recessive genes from both parents at an unprecedented rate. Every harmful mutation that had accumulated in the Habsburg bloodline over the centuries was expressed in his tortured body. He suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as multiple genetic disorders, including mandibular prognathism, mental retardation, epilepsy, and various metabolic disorders. The Spanish court struggled to maintain the fiction that Charles II was a normal, healthy heir to the throne. Official portraits were carefully composed to minimize his deformities, and court ceremonies were choreographed to hide his physical and mental limitations. Foreign ambassadors were coached on how to interact with the king in ways that wouldn't embarrass the royal family or reveal the extent of his disabilities. But whispers spread throughout European courts about the Mad King of Spain. Foreign diplomats reported back to their sovereigns about Charles II's bizarre behavior, his inability to conduct normal conversations, and his frequent seizures. Some described him as more animal than human, drooling uncontrollably and making incomprehensible sounds instead of speech. The psychological impact on Charles II himself can only be imagined. Trapped in a body that betrayed him at every turn, surrounded by courtiers who treated him like a dangerous child, he developed a deep paranoia and mistrust of those around him. He became convinced that he was under constant threat from poisoners and assassins, leading to elaborate food-tasting rituals and an obsessive fear of being alone. His diet was restricted to foods that could be swallowed without chewing: broths, porridge, and other liquid or semi-liquid substances. Even these caused him difficulty, as his jaw deformity made swallowing problematic. He remained painfully thin throughout his life, his body unable to extract adequate nutrition from the limited foods he could consume. The question of Charles II's marriage became a crisis for the Spanish monarchy. The king needed to produce an heir to continue the Habsburg line, but his physical and mental condition made it doubtful that he could fulfill the basic requirements of marriage. International marriage negotiations became exercises in deception, as Spanish diplomats attempted to arrange unions without revealing the full extent of the king's disabilities. In 1679 AD, when Charles II was 14 years old, he was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess and niece of Louis XIV. Marie-Louise was young, beautiful, and healthy, everything that Charles II was not. The marriage was intended to strengthen the alliance between France and Spain, but it was doomed from the beginning. Contemporary accounts of the wedding describe a bizarre ceremony where the teenage bride appeared terrified of her husband, while Charles II seemed barely aware of what was happening. He had difficulty standing throughout the ceremony and required constant assistance from his attendants. The consummation of the marriage was delayed for months due to Charles II's physical limitations and apparent lack of understanding about marital relations. Marie-Louise's letters to her family in France provide heartbreaking insights into life married to Charles II. She described him as more dead than alive, unable to hold normal conversations or participate in court activities. She wrote about his constant drooling, his seizures, and his tendency to speak in unintelligible fragments. Most tragically, she described her growing certainty that he would never be able to father children. The marriage lasted 10 years without producing an heir. Marie-Louise's health deteriorated under the stress of her situation, and she died suddenly in 1689 AD at age 26. Many suspected poison given the political tension surrounding the Spanish succession, but modern historians believe she likely died from the psychological and physical strain of her impossible marriage. Charles II's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690 AD was even more desperate. Maria Anna was a German princess, and the marriage was arranged as part of a complex web of alliances designed to prevent French domination of Europe. But like his first marriage, this union was incapable of producing the heir that Spain desperately needed. Maria Anna's accounts of life with Charles II paint an even more disturbing picture than those of his first wife. She described him as increasingly paranoid and prone to violent outbursts. He would spend hours staring at himself in mirrors, apparently fascinated by his own reflection. He developed obsessive rituals around food, clothing, and daily activities, becoming enraged if these routines were disrupted. The king's mental state continued to deteriorate throughout his 30s. He became convinced that he was under a curse and spent enormous sums on exorcists and religious ceremonies designed to break the supposed spell. He would stand for hours in front of religious relics, praying for divine intervention to cure his ailments. His devotion to Catholicism became extreme, even by the standards of the deeply religious Spanish court. Physically, Charles II aged rapidly. By his 20s, he appeared decades older than his chronological age. His hair became thin and grey, his skin took on a sickly pallor, and his already weak body grew progressively frailer. He suffered from chronic digestive problems, frequent infections, and a host of other ailments that his compromised immune system couldn't fight off effectively. The Spanish Empire, meanwhile, continued its decline. Without strong leadership from the monarchy, provincial governors and military commanders struggled to maintain order. Economic problems mounted as trade routes shifted and colonial revenues declined. Foreign powers circled like vultures, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line. The War of the Spanish Succession loomed on the horizon as European powers maneuvered for position in anticipation of Charles II's death. The king's obvious inability to produce an heir meant that the Spanish throne would eventually pass to a foreign dynasty, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe. Charles II was acutely aware of his situation. Despite his mental limitations, he understood that he was the last of his line and that his death would trigger a continental war. This knowledge added to his psychological torment as he struggled with the weight of responsibility for an empire he was incapable of governing effectively. His court became a surreal theatre of decay, where elaborate ceremonies continued to be performed around a king who could barely participate in them. Foreign ambassadors reported bizarre scenes where Charles II would sit silently through lengthy state dinners, drooling into his food and occasionally making incomprehensible sounds. Court musicians would play complex compositions while the king stared blankly ahead, apparently unaware of the music. The Spanish nobility, caught between loyalty to their king and recognition of his unfitness to rule, developed elaborate systems of governance that functioned around Charles II rather than through him. Important decisions were made by councils and advisors, with the king's role reduced to ceremonial appearances and the symbolic authority of his presence. Religious observances became increasingly central to court life, as everyone from the king to the lowest servants sought divine intervention in their impossible situation. The royal chapel saw constant masses, prayers, and ceremonies designed to intercede for the king's health and the future of the dynasty. Charles II himself became obsessed with religious relics and spent hours in prayer, apparently hoping that faith could accomplish what medicine and politics could not. The international implications of Charles II's condition cannot be overstated. Every European power had agents in the Spanish court, reporting on the king's health and speculating about the timing of his death. Marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances all had to account for the reality that Spain was ruled by a man who might die at any moment, and who would certainly die without leaving an heir. The French court of Louis XIV watched the situation with particular interest, as they had the strongest claim to the Spanish throne through various family connections. The Austrian Habsburgs also positioned themselves as potential heirs, arguing that the Spanish territories should revert to the main Habsburg line. Other European powers formed alliances and counter-alliances in preparation for the inevitable war that would follow Charles II's death. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Charles II's story is the human cost of the Habsburg experiment in genetic purity. Behind the political maneuvering and dynastic calculations was a man who suffered every day of his life from the consequences of his ancestors' choices. He experienced constant physical pain, social isolation, and the psychological torment of knowing that he was a disappointment to everyone around him. Contemporary accounts describe Charles II's attempts to find happiness despite his circumstances. He apparently enjoyed simple pleasures like watching court entertainments, though his participation was limited by his physical and mental condition. He showed affection for his pets, and seemed to find comfort in routine activities like prayer and meals, even though eating was a struggle for him. His relationship with his mother, Queen Mariana, was complex and troubled. She had spent his childhood desperately trying to find cures for his condition, consulting physicians, priests, and even folk healers in search of relief for her son's suffering. As he grew older, she became increasingly protective, attempting to shield him from the harsh realities of his situation while simultaneously pushing him to fulfill his royal duties. The Queen Mother's own health suffered from the stress of raising Charles II. She developed nervous disorders and chronic illnesses that court physicians attributed to the constant worry about her son's condition. Her letters to family members in Austria reveal a woman trapped between love for her child and despair over his future. The Spanish people, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the full extent of their king's disabilities. Official proclamations and public ceremonies were carefully managed to maintain the fiction of royal competence. When Charles II appeared in public, it was only for brief, highly choreographed events where his limitations could be hidden or explained away. But rumours spread throughout Spanish society about the cursed king. Folk tales developed about his condition, with explanations ranging from supernatural curses to divine punishment for royal sins. Some stories claimed that he had been switched at birth with a changeling, while others suggested that he was the victim of witchcraft or poison. The economic impact of Charles II's reign was devastating for Spain. The lack of strong central leadership allowed corruption to flourish throughout the government. Trade policies were inconsistent and often contradictory, as different advisors pushed competing agendas without clear direction from the throne. Colonial administration suffered as governors realized that they were unlikely to face consequences for their actions. The Spanish military, once the most formidable force in Europe, declined precipitously during Charles II's reign. Without a warrior king to lead them, Spanish armies lost battle after battle to better organized French, Dutch, and English forces. The loss of military prestige further weakened Spain's position in European politics and contributed to the empire's economic decline. Religious institutions, ironically, thrived during Charles II's reign. The king's obsession with spiritual matters led to increased funding for churches, monasteries, and religious ceremonies. The Spanish Inquisition, always a powerful force in Spanish society, gained additional influence as the royal court became increasingly focused on religious explanations for the king's condition. The arts and culture of Spain also reflected the strange atmosphere of Charles II's court. Paintings from this period often have a surreal, almost nightmarish quality, reflecting the psychological tension of a society governed by a man who seemed more spectre than king. Literature of the period frequently deals with themes of decay, madness, and divine punishment. As Charles II entered his 30s, his condition continued to deteriorate. The seizures became more frequent and severe, sometimes lasting for hours and leaving him unconscious for days afterward. His speech, never clear, became almost entirely unintelligible. He required constant assistance with basic activities like eating, dressing, and walking. The question of the Spanish succession became more urgent with each passing year. Foreign powers pressed their claims more aggressively, and the threat of war grew more imminent. Charles II, despite his mental limitations, understood that he held the fate of Europe in his hands. The weight of this responsibility added to his psychological torment. In his final years, Charles II became increasingly isolated from the world around him. He spent most of his time in his private chambers, attended by a small group of loyal servants who had learned to interpret his needs and desires. His days were structured around rigid routines that provided some comfort in his chaotic mental state. The king's physical appearance by this time was shocking, even to those who knew him well. His body was emaciated, his skin had a grey, lifeless quality, and his hair was thin and white despite his relatively young age. The Habsburg lip had become so pronounced that it dominated his facial features, making him appear almost grotesque. His eating difficulties had worsened to the point where he could only consume liquids and the softest foods. Even these caused him problems, as his jaw deformity made swallowing difficult and dangerous. He frequently choked on his food, requiring constant supervision during meals. The psychological impact of his condition on Charles II became more apparent as he aged. He developed elaborate paranoid fantasies about enemies trying to poison him or steal his throne. He would spend hours examining his food for signs of contamination, and refused to eat anything that hadn't been prepared by a trusted servant. His relationship with his wife Maria Anna became increasingly strained. She had initially hoped that patience and care might help him overcome some of his difficulties, but the reality of his condition eventually overwhelmed her optimism. She withdrew from court life and spent most of her time in her private apartments, effectively abandoning her husband to his isolation. The Spanish court, meanwhile, continued to function around the fiction of royal competence. Ceremonies were performed, decisions were made, and the business of government continued. But everyone understood that Charles II was merely a symbolic figure. Real power rested with advisors, ministers, and foreign diplomats who manipulated the situation to their advantage. The international situation grew more tense as Charles II's health visibly declined. Every cough, every seizure, every sign of weakness was reported to foreign courts and analysed for implications about the timing of his death. Military preparations began in earnest as European powers positioned themselves for the coming conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession was not just a political inevitability, it was the logical conclusion of 2 centuries of Habsburg genetic experimentation. The dynasty that had once ruled half the world had bred itself into extinction, leaving behind only a broken man whose very existence testified to the dangers of prioritizing bloodline purity over human health. Charles II's story became a cautionary tale even during his lifetime. Other European royal families, observing the Habsburg disaster, began to reconsider their own marriage practices. The extreme inbreeding that had characterized European nobility for centuries started to give way to more diverse marriage patterns, though the change was gradual and often met with resistance from traditionalists. The medical understanding of the time was insufficient to comprehend the genetic basis of Charles II's condition, but the connection between family intermarriage and the health problems of their offspring was becoming impossible to ignore. Court physicians began to quietly advise against marriages between close relatives, though they lacked the scientific knowledge to explain why such unions were dangerous. The Spanish people, meanwhile, suffered under the rule of their incapacitated king. Economic problems mounted as trade declined and colonial revenues fell. Social unrest increased as the government proved incapable of addressing the concerns of ordinary citizens. The proud Spanish Empire that had once dominated European politics was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Charles II's final years were marked by increasing desperation about the succession. He knew that he would never father children, but he clung to the hope that some miracle might preserve the Habsburg line. He consulted physicians, priests, and even folk healers, seeking any remedy that might allow him to fulfill his dynastic obligations. The king's religious devotion reached extreme levels during this period. He spent hours each day in prayer, often prostrating himself before religious relics and begging for divine intervention. His chambers were filled with religious artifacts, and he required constant spiritual counseling from priests and religious advisors. His mental state became increasingly fragile as the reality of his situation pressed upon him. He suffered from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoid delusions. He would sometimes refuse to leave his chambers for days at a time, convinced that enemies were waiting to harm him. At other times he would become agitated and demand to be taken to various religious sites throughout the palace. The physical deterioration continued relentlessly. By his late 30s, Charles II looked like a man in his 70s. His body was so weak that he could barely walk, even with assistance. His digestive system was so compromised that he could only tolerate the most basic foods, and even these caused him significant discomfort. His seizures became more frequent and severe, sometimes occurring multiple times per day. After each episode, he would remain unconscious for hours, leaving the court in uncertainty about whether he had survived. These seizures were particularly terrifying for observers, as Charles II's already distorted features would become even more grotesque during the convulsions. The international implications of each health crisis were enormous. Foreign ambassadors maintained constant vigil, ready to report any change in the king's condition to their governments. Military commanders throughout Europe kept their forces in readiness, knowing that Charles II's death would trigger the largest European war in decades. The Spanish government, such as it was, functioned in a state of constant crisis. Important decisions were postponed indefinitely while ministers waited to see if the king would survive his latest health emergency. Foreign policy became reactive rather than proactive, as Spanish diplomats lacked the authority to make long-term commitments. The economy suffered accordingly. Trade agreements were difficult to negotiate when foreign merchants weren't sure whether Spain would still exist as a coherent state in the coming months. Colonial administration became increasingly chaotic as governors realized that their orders from Madrid might be obsolete by the time they arrived. The Spanish military, once the terror of Europe, had become a hollow shell of its former self. Officers knew that they served a king who couldn't lead them into battle and who might die at any moment. Morale plummeted, and desertion rates soared as soldiers questioned their loyalty to a dynasty that seemed cursed. The social fabric of Spanish society began to unravel under the strain. The traditional authority of the monarchy was undermined by the obvious incompetence of the king. Regional governors began to assert more independence, and local nobles started to question their obligations to the central government. Religious institutions paradoxically gained influence during this period of political chaos. The Spanish Inquisition expanded its activities, claiming that the king's condition was divine punishment for religious laxity. Priests and monks found themselves consulted on political matters as desperate officials sought spiritual solutions to temporal problems. The arts and literature of the period reflected the bizarre atmosphere of Charles II's court. Painters created works that seemed to capture the surreal quality of a kingdom ruled by a living ghost. Writers produced stories and poems that dealt with themes of madness, decay, and divine judgment, often using thinly veiled references to the royal family. Charles II himself became increasingly aware of his role as a symbol of dynastic failure. Despite his mental limitations, he understood that his very existence was a source of shame and embarrassment to his family and his kingdom. This knowledge added to his psychological torment and contributed to his growing isolation from the world around him. His attempts to find meaning in his suffering led to increasingly elaborate religious rituals. He would spend entire days in prayer, sometimes refusing food or water in an effort to purify himself spiritually. He became obsessed with the idea that his condition was a test from God, and that proper devotion might lead to a miraculous cure. The Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, watched her son's deterioration with growing horror. She had spent his entire life trying to find solutions to his problems, consulting every physician, priest, and folk healer she could find. As he entered his final years, she finally began to accept that there was no cure for the genetic disaster that had befallen her family. Her own health declined rapidly during this period. The stress of caring for Charles II and managing the political crisis surrounding his condition took a severe toll on her physical and mental well-being. She developed nervous disorders and chronic illnesses that physicians attributed to the constant worry about her son's future. The international situation grew more precarious with each passing month. The major European powers had essentially given up on the idea that Charles II might produce an heir, and were now openly planning for the partition of the Spanish Empire. Treaties were negotiated, armies were positioned, and diplomatic alliances were formed in preparation for the coming war. The Spanish people, meanwhile, began to lose faith in their monarchy entirely. The contrast between the glorious past of the Spanish Empire and the pathetic present of their disabled king was too stark to ignore. Popular songs and stories began to mock the royal family, though always carefully to avoid direct criticism that might attract the attention of the Inquisition. The economic decline accelerated as international confidence in Spanish stability evaporated. Foreign merchants demanded immediate payment for goods, unwilling to extend credit to a kingdom that might not exist in a few months. Colonial trade routes shifted to other European powers, further reducing Spanish revenues. The military situation became desperate as Spain's enemies sensed weakness. French forces pressed Spanish positions along the Pyrenees, while Dutch and English fleets challenged Spanish shipping in the Atlantic. The Spanish military, demoralized and poorly led, suffered defeat after defeat. Charles II's final years were marked by a growing sense of apocalyptic doom. He seemed to understand that his death would trigger a catastrophic war that would destroy the empire his ancestors had built. This knowledge added to his psychological torment and contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior. The king's eating problems worsened to the point where he could barely consume enough nutrition to survive. His weight dropped to dangerously low levels, and his already weakened immune system became even more compromised. He suffered from constant infections and illnesses that would have been minor problems for a healthy person. His speech, never clear, became almost entirely unintelligible. He communicated primarily through gestures and facial expressions, though even these were limited by his physical deformities. His isolation from the world became almost complete as fewer and fewer people could understand his needs and desires. The seizures that had plagued him throughout his life became more frequent and severe. He would sometimes experience multiple episodes per day, leaving him unconscious for hours at a time. After each seizure, he would awaken confused and disoriented, often unaware of where he was or what had happened. The psychological impact of his condition became more apparent as his mental state deteriorated further. He developed elaborate paranoid fantasies about enemies trying to harm him, and he became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. He would spend hours examining his food for signs of poison and refused to trust anyone except a small group of loyal servants. His relationship with his wife Maria Anna had deteriorated to the point where they rarely saw each other. She had essentially given up hope that he might recover and had withdrawn from court life entirely. The marriage that had been arranged to provide an heir to the Spanish throne had become a source of mutual torment. The Spanish court continued to function around the fiction of royal competence, but the charade was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Foreign diplomats reported back to their governments about the king's bizarre behavior and obvious incapacity, making it clear that Spain was effectively without leadership. The international situation reached a crisis point as Charles II's health visibly declined. Every European power was preparing for war, and the question was no longer whether the Spanish Empire would survive, but how it would be divided among the victors. The king's very existence had become an obstacle to peace. The Spanish people, meanwhile, began to prepare for the inevitable. Regional governors started to assert more independence, positioning themselves to survive the coming chaos. Local nobles began to question their loyalty to a dynasty that seemed doomed. The social fabric of Spanish society was unraveling as the center of power collapsed. The final months of Charles II's life were marked by increasing desperation and declining physical capacity. He could barely leave his chambers, and when he did appear in public, it was only for brief, carefully orchestrated events. His appearance was so shocking that foreign visitors often expressed disbelief that this was the King of Spain. His eating difficulties had become so severe that he could only consume liquids and the softest foods. Even these caused him problems, as his jaw deformity made swallowing difficult and dangerous. He required constant supervision during meals to prevent choking. The seizures continued to plague him, occurring with increasing frequency and severity. After each episode, he would remain unconscious for longer periods, leaving the court in uncertainty about whether he had survived. These seizures were particularly disturbing for observers, as his already distorted features would become even more grotesque during the convulsions. His mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was often confused about his surroundings and unable to recognize familiar faces. He would sometimes call out for dead relatives or react to hallucinations that only he could see. The psychological impact of his condition had become as debilitating as his physical problems. The international implications of each health crisis were enormous. Foreign ambassadors maintained constant vigil, ready to report any change in the king's condition to their governments. Military commanders throughout Europe kept their forces in readiness, knowing that Charles II's death would trigger the largest European war in decades. On November 1, 1700 AD, Charles II of Spain died at the age of 34. His body, ravaged by a lifetime of genetic disorders, finally surrendered to the inevitable. The court physicians, who had spent decades trying to treat conditions they couldn't understand, recorded his death with a mixture of relief and dread. The king's final moments were as tragic as his entire life had been. He died alone except for a handful of servants, his wife having withdrawn from court entirely. His last words were reportedly incomprehensible, a final testament to the speech difficulties that had plagued him since childhood. The Habsburg lip that had defined his appearance remained grotesquely prominent even in death. With Charles II's death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended forever. The empire that had once ruled half the world was left without an heir, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession that would reshape European politics for the next decade. The genetic experiment that had begun with such promise in the 15th century had culminated in the extinction of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The autopsy of Charles II's body revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe. His organs were described by physicians as putrefied and corrupted, though they lacked the scientific knowledge to understand that these abnormalities were the result of centuries of inbreeding. His brain was found to be smaller than normal, his digestive system was severely malformed, and his reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that he could never have fathered children. The Spanish people received news of their king's death with a mixture of grief and relief. While they mourned the end of their royal dynasty, many understood that Charles II's suffering had finally ended. The empire he left behind was bankrupt, militarily weak, and politically fragmented, a shadow of the great power it had once been. The international consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Within days of Charles II's death, European armies began to march. The War of the Spanish Succession would rage for 13 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe. The genetic disaster of the Habsburg family had become a continental catastrophe. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Charles II's story was the lesson it taught about the dangers of genetic isolation. Other European royal families, observing the Habsburg disaster, began to reconsider their own marriage practices. The extreme inbreeding that had characterized European nobility for centuries started to give way to more diverse patterns, though the change was gradual and often met with resistance. The story of Charles II became a cautionary tale that echoed through the centuries. Here was a dynasty that had conquered empires, accumulated vast wealth, and wielded unprecedented power, yet had destroyed itself through the systematic pursuit of genetic purity. The queen who had birthed this monster had given life to the living embodiment of royal hubris. In the shadowed corridors of the Alcázar of Madrid, where our story began, silence finally fell. The screams of childbirth that had echoed through those halls 35 years earlier had been replaced by the silence of death. The genetic experiment that had begun with such confidence had ended in failure, leaving behind only the memory of a broken man, whose very existence testified to the horror of what happens when bloodline purity becomes more important than human health. The Habsburg lip disappeared from European royal courts, but the lesson remained. Some victories come at a price too terrible to pay, and some monsters are born not from evil, but from the calculated choices of those who believed they could improve upon nature itself. In the end, the queen who birthed a monster had only given birth to the inevitable conclusion of her family's genetic gamble, a gamble that cost them everything.